On today with Josh Phillips of the Epoch Times. I'm in Cincinnati right now for the Thanksgiving holiday. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving as well, Josh. But thanks for joining me today, man.
That was great, man. Always a pleasure, and anytime, man.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there are some things happening in China right now. There are massive protests taking place. I think we're on day 4 of people protesting the COVID lockdowns. This has been going on for years. We've seen video coming out of China of people being locked into their homes, being welded into their homes, people jumping out of the windows to commit suicide. And this is the third or fourth round of intense lockdowns that we've seen from the CCP and a bid to ostensibly control the COVID outbreak that's taken place in China. What do you make of what's going on right now?
Yeah, well, you might remember some of the really like horrific videos, like just haunting videos where people are recording at their balconies at night, and you just hear this like chorus of screams from all the different apartment buildings of people locked in their homes. There were stories of people like starving to death. There were stories of people dying. There's videos, for example, of police welding people's doors shut, nailing in metal bars so they can't open their doors. And for some people, that's been a death sentence. What's interesting with the new protests, because as you mentioned, they've been going on a little bit, not as big as this. This is kind of rolling the clock back to like pre-COVID, right before the lockdowns hit, when there were protests big enough, kind of brewing. Remember the Hong Kong protests were happening, brewing protests that had the CCP shaking in its boots. This is like they couldn't keep the genie in the bottle. They couldn't keep the lid on it, and the whole thing is blowing up right now. What happened is interesting, though. Basically, there was, people in Urumqi in Xinjiang, which is like where they have the Muslim Uyghurs, right? One of the persecuted groups in China. It's like Western China. There were people who were locked in their building. There's different competing, kind of conflicting reports. Oh, they weren't tightly locked down and whatever. There's like video coming out now where the door handle was wired shut so people couldn't escape from their apartments. A fire broke out in the apartment and people burned to death. They say, the CCP says 10 people died. Who knows the real number? Because they always lie about this kind of stuff. Regardless, the Chinese people took that as a lesson. And that's one of the main triggers of these like large scale protests right now. They're realizing the CCP will lock you in your home as you burn to death with you and your family. And that for them is, COVID lockdown. They will turn your health card on your phone red, which means you have to go sign up for, COVID camp and little concentration camps they're building. And as this is happening, the CCP is building like city-size concentration camps, white buildings. They look like they're 2 or 3 stories tall, and just like as far as the eye can see. Like you take multiple suburbs and put them together, it's like that big. It's massive, dude. People are seeing this coming on the horizon, and they're weighing their car. They're kind of weighing the scales, and they're saying, you know what? Is it safer for me to be silent? Is it safer for me to just keep taking it on the chin and just keep dealing with it, whatever they want to throw at me? Or is it safer for me to go on the streets and risk getting, Tiananmen squared by the CCP? Which one is safer? And people are taking option 2 because they see where they're heading. They see where these policies, these lockdowns, these forever COVID policies, they see where that's leading, and they don't want that. They're willing right now to go out and face the CCP and face who knows what, live organ harvesting, maybe being shipped off in trains to who knows where. That for them is a safer option. And they're coming out like massive, massive droves in some of the biggest cities in the country. Shanghai, Beijing, Wuhan, you name it. It's huge right now what's happening.
And that's the variable that basically makes this process a little bit different than some of the other ones we've seen. I mean, there are uprisings that are taking place all across the world right now. We have protests raging in Brazil. We have protests that have been going on for pushing 2 months now over in Iran, where their law enforcement authorities have actually been opening fire using live rounds against protesters.
Yeah.
And some people were wondering, hey, when it comes to China, are the protests that we're seeing right now going to be something that sort of turns the tide and helps not only protests there, but protests around the world sort of take on a different life? And maybe we'll start to see the toppling of some of these authoritarian regimes. But it sounds like with what's happening right now and the people in China's backs being put against the wall, they have nothing to lose at this point, because not standing up to it and being forced into these camps for God knows how long might be a worse option. So do you think this could be a tipping point and a point of where we might be able to start to see real change in some of the fall of these authoritarian regimes around the world?
I think we're hitting that point. The comparison people usually make when it comes to like totalitarian policy is the boiling frog, where they do this picture of a frog in a pot of water, and someone turns on the fire, and the fire basically turns up. The water heats up over time, and the frog doesn't realize it's being boiled alive. It doesn't hop out of the pot. I'll tell you right now, the frog is hopping out of the pot. They turn the heat up too high. I think we're at the stage right now where people are realizing exactly what's happening, and they're jumping out of it. They won't take it anymore. Now that's going to leave these regimes with two choices: either they try to roll things back, or they make things worse. In other words, they either try to appease the crowds and risk whatever ends up happening. Maybe they have to negotiate with them. Maybe they have to remove some of the policies they want in place, delay maybe their agendas, or they need to strengthen the policies and go even further with what they're doing. China is an interesting case study in this because they've already pushed things so far. They've already pushed things so far that it's hard for them to roll things back. And they've pushed things so far that the people right now know what they're up against. The people are like willing to die. They're at that level. Like every person on the street right now is like that guy in the Tiananmen Square massacre who went and stood in front of the tank, knowing that he was, they could run him over, they could shoot him, and they might do it. All of them are facing the prospect of death. They know exactly what they're dealing with. And they're willing to deal with that rather than face the future the CCP is offering them. They're past the point of no return. And that does bring up the question for the CCP, like, what do, right? Do they Tiananmen Square massacre them, as I mentioned? Well, the word's going to spread in China, and that could be the end of the CCP. If word spreads in China. They could appease the crowd, and they've already started doing that a little bit in Urumqi, which is interesting because it shows the CCP is trying to go the other way. They're not doing it enough, I'll tell you right now. They're not doing it enough to fix it. So what do they do from here? I think this is why everyone's kind of watching it right now. The other important point to mention with this, though, is what happens in China, really reflects here. People used to say, someone sneezes in China, the whole world gets sick. Well, the CCP rolls out these totalitarian policies. The whole world adopted them to some extent. The mask mandates, the QR health codes on your phone, the vaccine mandates, the lockdowns, these were all the China model. And that we adopted it in the West because the World Health Organization was saying, hey, this works. But they were saying it works because China was doing it and the CCP was lying about the numbers. We are following the China model. And the big question was, will we follow it the whole way through? Are we gonna end up with facial recognition technology and digital currencies and social credit systems? Are we gonna end up with that? The interesting thing is even the Biden administration right now is saying that China's policies will not work here. In other words, they've been assessing, will the American people take this? I'll tell you what, even the Chinese people aren't taking it, let alone the American people. So, what's happening there is pretty important for us too.
What's pretty wild about this to me is that this is a virus. We now have 2 years of having learned about what COVID is and what this virus does, how it's transmitted, who's most impacted, et cetera, on and on. And one thing that we know is that there's no way to contain a virus with a lockdown. None of the lockdown measures that we saw around the world actually worked and were effective at all at stopping or containing transmission. When we look at charts of the outbreaks that have been happening in China, it sort of looks like with these heavy-handed containment measures, they haven't even really had their first wave. Yeah. They're delaying the inevitable. So is China's zero COVID policy a sincere effort to try to contain the virus in light of all the information that we have and really despite all the information that we have? Or is this simply an excuse by the CCP to exert some sort of, again, totalitarian control over the population?
It looks like the latter. It's exerting totalitarian control of the population. There's two ways you can look at it. And look, believe what people want, right? You either believe COVID-19 is a danger to society and deadly, or you don't. And if you believe it's a danger and deadly to society, well, then you follow the vaccine stuff and you follow the idea that maybe these things work. Look, when it comes to China on that side of it, one of the big criticisms they're having right now, even from the health communities, is you don't have natural immunity. People have been shielded from it, but guess what? That virus is still out there, and it's probably endemic at this point. People, it's the new seasonal flu, and if you have people with no immunity for it, what's going to happen as soon as they're let out of the houses? We don't know. China is a little petri dish, and we're going to all watch, and see what happens to them. Who knows right now? But people are saying it's not going to be pretty. That's one side of it. That's if you believe COVID is actually an issue. On the other side of it is if you don't believe it's an issue. And the CCP right now is using COVID not for COVID. They're using the policies in ways that do not represent it. You had people, for example, who went to go protest the bank stealing their money. Right? One of the banks, was having issues. People wanted to get their money back. There was a run on the bank. People go there to protest because they're losing their life savings. I'm not exaggerating. They're losing their life savings because the bank wouldn't give them their money, and the bank was having issues. They go to protest. They get off the train. They scan the little QR code because it's your health pass, and the thing turns red. And guess what? Rather than going there to protest, all the protesters had to go check themselves into COVID prison, into whatever you want to call it. They had to check themselves into quarantine. The CCP, in other words, is using these COVID camps and lockdowns and so on in ways that have nothing to do with the virus. It's about social control. And the concerning part that I think a lot of people have is, will COVID end up being about not COVID? Will COVID end up being about stripping us of our rights? Will COVID be about concentration camps? Will it be about political persecution? Well, I'll tell you what, in China, it already is. And so those are the two factors to watch here.
Now, Apple released a software update that was basically limiting the use of AirDrop in China because it was being used by protesters to share videos and photos directly, essentially bypassing China's firewall. How does somebody reconcile the fact that these companies that tout themselves as being, social justice warriors and all about social justice and advancing civil liberties for people and standing up for human rights, et cetera. How do we reconcile the fact that they're working with actual literal communists right now?
Oh, Adrian, I think you asked like the $1 million question, because I've been asking that too. Look, Apple and Nike, these are companies, all these companies, these are companies that preach to us about social justice, and they like to criticize America because, the history of slavery, which, fair enough, criticize it. But meanwhile, they're doing business with China and they're using slave labor. There are slave camps in China, and the companies preaching to us are using it. Almost the entire garment industry uses Chinese slave labor. Most of the manufacturers like cars use Chinese slave labor. Apple, look, they have suicide nets outside the Foxconn building. You can't even kill yourself, right? People are so miserable, and they're working 7 days a week or whatever, working 16-hour days. They want to kill themselves, and they can't even kill themselves. That's the quality of life these people are living under, while the companies doing that try to preach to us about social justice. And as you mentioned, like they talk about the rights of citizens and this beautiful future and so on. Look, and they're helping the CCP make it so people can't share videos of protests or videos of abuses by a totalitarian, murderous regime that has killed somewhere between 70 million and 150 million people, depending on what numbers you go by. That's what those companies really stand for. It does make you really question, they don't believe in the narrative they're trying to feed us. They tell us one thing on this side of the world, and they say something very different on the other side of the world. What do these companies really believe in? Like, what is this stuff really about? Because I don't think they frankly believe anything they're trying to tell us.
So what can we as Americans do? Is there anything that Congress can do, any steps that the Biden administration could take to have any sort of role in what's taking place right now?
I'd say expose it. Expose it. What we're in right now is an ideological war. And the CCP is an example of where we could go if people don't become aware of where we're heading. You need to watch what's happening with China, because that could be our future if nothing's done about it. And also public awareness of it, you tweeting it out and sharing videos and making some noise about it, that is making it so the CCP restrains itself a little bit too. Public awareness is the weak point of the CCP. It's why they try to censor. It's why they have the Great Firewall. It's why Apple is helping them, people not share, helping the CCP make it so people can't share videos. It's because they're afraid of the truth getting out. And it's also that awareness that's going to make sure that that stuff never happens here in policy, because there are people, not all of them, but there are people who want that here. I mentioned World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab was just on Chinese state media talking about how the China is a role model for many countries in the world, and it could be one option that countries could actually adopt as they go into this whole great reset they want. He sounded like he had some issues with it, but it's true. There are countries heading in that direction, and that is going to be the future if people don't properly expose it and stand up to it.
Now, you're a China expert, and you've got a great documentary that's out now through Epoch Times. Tell people about the doc, what they can expect to see, and actually how that's doing right now as well.
It's doing pretty good. We released, so the documentary is called The Final War, and it's about the Chinese Communist Party's 100-year plan to defeat the United States. How they've, going back to Mao Zedong, leading up through all the different leaders of China, up to where we are right now with Xi Jinping. They have never abandoned this policy. What they have done is lied to the U.S., basically got foreign investment to prop up the CCP. Wall Street is basically bankrolling the Chinese Communist Party, which is crazy if you think about it. The same guys pushing these ESG, environmental social governance standards here, and all these woke policies, they're bankrolling the Communist Party of China on the other side of the world. Like, they're pouring money into it. Some of the biggest names like BlackRock, they're pouring money. They're even taking government pensions and pouring money into it. Like, if you're a government worker, your pension might have been poured into the CCP. If the CCP falls, there goes your pension, thanks to these companies. But the CCP has a 100-year plan against the United States. They want to defeat America. The slogan they use is "We live, you die." They don't believe that the communist system can coexist in this world with the American system. Because as long as the American system exists, there's this idea of human rights. As long as the American system exists, there's the idea that you are given rights by God, and government is there to defend those rights, and that's the role of government. That's antithetical to what the CCP represents, and antithetical to the way a lot of these groups want to move the world. Really, the American idea is a shot over the bow to every totalitarian system on earth. And really, I think why, since the beginning of the American system, they've been trying to destroy it. The CCP represents the clearest threat against that, and they're not being silent about it. They call COVID, the actual phrase they use for it, they call it a World War III scenario. That's how they regard this.
Now, is this the Great Rejuvenation Plan?
It's part of that. Part of that. They're talking. They do talk about that. They have all kinds of slogans for it. They talk about China 2035 and China 2049 and so on and so on. They have all kinds of names for these things. Basically what it is, they just launch these 5-year plans, 15-year plans, and so on. And it's just about how they want to move towards this agenda. This documentary is about the overall agenda. What are they moving towards? And more specifically, what are they doing to the United States to undermine us as they move towards that goal? And what does it mean for us once they reach that goal? I'll tell you right now, they talk about wiping out America. In fact, I'll tell you something freaky. We include in the documentary, again, it's on Epoch TV, epochtv.com, and it's called The Final War. There was a poll done it was done through the Chinese military, and it asked people, if you were given an order, would you execute men, would you execute prisoners of war, women, and children? Would you shoot a kid if your superior told you to do it? An overwhelming majority of the Chinese people said they would, which is concerning. A very, very small percentage said they wouldn't under any circumstance. That raised a lot of criticisms abroad on, well, why is the Chinese military asking its people if they would execute, women and children and kill political prisoners? Like, why would they be doing this, right? One of the Chinese Communist Party military leaders came out and actually said something, which is they did the poll because they wanted to see how much support they would have if they had to, quote unquote, clean up America, right? Clean up America by executing women and children and killing political prisoners. That's what they're talking about.
Well, it just makes another argument to make sure we maintain our Second Amendment.
Yeah, you spot on, man. Yeah. A gun behind every blade of grass, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, Josh, thanks so much for talking with me. I appreciate it, and I hope people go check out the documentary. Again, you said it's on Epoch TV right now, correct?
Yep, on epochtv.com. Thanks again, Eric. Always a pleasure, man. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.